Good evening. I'm Socrates Garrett, and we're broadcasting live from right here in Jackson, Mississippi, the heart of the Deep South, right here in the African-American owned broadcasting studio. We believe digital.com, our own platform. And so it's critically important that in the African-American community, we control the narrative. I look forward to receiving opportunities to show and advertise your products for goods and services and to move your brand along in this community. We're broadcasting live on Facebook. When We Believe Digital Podcast, go to Roku and download our app, and We Believe Global, with shows like this to bring articulate, intelligent conversations and dialogue to our platform. So I'm here to continue sounding the alarm. This is how the South is going to rise again. Welcome to Socrates Garrett Live. We're broadcasting from Jackson, Mississippi, in an African-American owned broadcasting studio. We've been seen on Facebook, on YouTube, on Roku TV, and our own WeBelieveDigital.com platform. On Roku TV, we sit right next to Showtime and other apps. Just download the app for We Believe Digital and enjoy articulate shows like the one we're going to bring you tonight. As always, my co-host is Dr. Eldridge Henderson, and he's in the studio with us tonight. Doc, how have you been?
Well, I'm doing fine, sir. Every day I feel better, and I've been telling myself I'm going to work at least another 30 years because every day I'm feeling better. And I have an 8-year goal that I'm working on, and it's getting so good I believe I'm going to have to add some more time to it.
Well, work is the key to it. Work is one of those things that you do when you're in trouble. It's one of those things you do when you're happy. It's one of those things that just kind of soothes the mind.
It does.
And it allows you to just get in touch with yourself and find out exactly what's going on inside of you.
Exactly.
You know, Doc, we are celebrating Juneteenth. And Juneteenth is a holiday now, proclaimed national holiday for African Americans all over this country. And yet sometimes I wonder if we know exactly what we're celebrating and why. So I think it's going to be important that we remind our viewers all over this world, especially those of African American origin and descent, exactly what is it that we're celebrating and why. Now, it's my understanding that, you know, during the Emancipation Proclamation, the slaves were freed. But some 2 years later, 1865, I believe, 2 years later, before the blacks in Texas knew that they had been freed. And so, but do they know what they were freed from? And so this is the kind of dialogue that I think is going to be critically important to our audience. I want you to go back and just give us a little chronology of what has happened to African Americans leading up to this national holiday.
Well, the facts are very clear. There are a lot of facts, and I only address facts. To give you in summary, black people are worse off economically, politically, socially, and religiously since 1960. We have fallen in all those categories. We have ruined ourselves by putting a lot of emphasis and confidence in the very people that have always planned us out of society through their codification process, through their political process, through their religious process, and especially economic. Even during the time of wars, they didn't want blacks to assert themselves in the wars. They didn't want them to learn how to use weapons. When they finally got to the point where they were about to lose, they allowed them to get involved in the Revolutionary War, in World War I, World War II, and they had an opportunity in World War II to get blacks to fly the planes to help destroy Hitler. And they hesitated on that for months and months. And finally, they trained some blacks to fly airplanes during the World War II period. In Vietnam, they had a similar problem. Since they were in a war where they conscripted people, they say we have a lot of blacks now. They are violent. They are demonstrating, and we're going to put them in the military. And they grabbed people like me and put us in the military to fight Vietnam people that were trying to protect themselves from the northern aggressors who were alleged to be communist. And we had to go through that. And all the time, the government, as they were during the Revolutionary War, planning to destroy black people. And I mean especially black people.
Now, Doc, we're going to go back a little bit even further than that in terms of, you know, when blacks during the slave trade, when African Americans were sold, stole, however they were acquired and put on those ships coming over here to America. Those were some terrible, terrible times. And this is important to go through that because we're going to get up to why we're celebrating here today with all of the festivities that are planned throughout this country. And 60% of the African American population does not have a clue as to what happened with their ancestors, what happened to their parents, and what happened to other African Americans, the struggle, the despair that they went through just so that we could get here today and finally be recognized as a national holiday. This slave trade thing was a serious business, Doc.
That was the most serious business in America during that time, and the result has been just as serious when I'm talking about the abolition of the trade, slave trade. Matter of fact, that was even worse because they had the black people locked in then. When you get a group of people locked in and then exclude education, politics, religion, and socialization from those people, and you control all of those aspects, and you make the rules and regulations, you have a total group of human beings that's going to be in a point where they can't be competitive, and that'll give you an opportunity to look at them as an outcast, as a non-entity, as a non-person. And then you automatically treat them that way and make them feel that way. And that's why when people start talking about June, I believe it's 19th or what they call it?
Juneteenth.
Juneteenth, they don't understand that that was a planned session where they wanted to prolong slavery, and that this celebration that you all are going to be celebrating is nothing but an extension of historical racism and non-constitutional government for black folks.
Wow.
I wouldn't waste not 1 minute on June the 19th, Juneteenth, unless I was talking about the facts, just as I'm talking about it today. There's nothing to celebrate.
And that's what we're talking about here today. There's nothing to celebrate. There are only work to be done, and a tremendous amount of work that has to be done. Now, Doc, the slave business was so cruel and so violent until even during the Civil War. This is how serious it was. Over 800,000 Europeans died in the Civil War trying to keep black folk in bondage, in slavery, under control on these plantations. They gave up 800,000 lives for that. And that was to try and keep white supremacy and the quality of life and a way of living intact, especially here in the South.
Exactly. And then what people don't talk about is over 200,000 of those were black soldiers. And more black soldiers fought for the South than the North. To give you an example, in New Orleans, they had 2 battalions of blacks. Now, they did have white officers, but those groups that called themselves mulattoes, in that area, they had over 6,000 black people that owned slaves in the United States during that time. Over 6,000. And some of those black slave owners loved their positions of responsibility because they were, in their minds, equal to whites. And many of them had white fathers and mothers. And of course, they were put in another channel, another segment, and they were taught that blacks were totally worthless. Because even though they were considered black themselves, they knew they weren't slaves. I'm talking about the so-called freed blacks.
Well, the deal is here that we got to get through this history. We got to understand what black folk went through coming up through that period, during the slavery period, during the Reconstruction period, and all of the things that have gone on in American history, which is reminiscent of world history, because the same things were happening to black folk all over the world, whether they were in France, England, or wherever they are. Black folks were treated as inferior people. They should be servants and they should obey their masters. And so they were taught that and they were treated that way. And then things didn't get any better, even after the slaves were freed. Even though we celebrate Juneteenth as a day of independence, we still have not achieved independence as of today.
We have not. And I'm going to be frank with you and tell you, the reason we don't have independence as of today, with all the opportunities that we have had, is because we didn't take advantage of the opportunities. So we are the blame. It would be inappropriate for me to put all our problems on the white supremacists, the racists, and all the constitutional specialists that decided that black folks were inhuman. They haven't passed not one law to do anything good for black folks in the history of America, not one, on the local, state, or national level, where they passed a law and it was equal for all the citizens. Not one.
Right. And so we got to deal with it. And yeah, I know there's a lot of blame that African Americans should shoulder. But they came through some terrible times. Those were terrible times. Now, you and I are the same generation. And I recall the hangings and the murderers and all of the things that were happening in the black communities in the state of Mississippi in the 1950s and the 1960s. I mean, Doc, as a boy of some 14 years old when Emmett Till was so brutally murdered because he supposedly whistled at a white woman, it sent shockwaves through all African-American male children throughout this entire state. They knew then that their life wasn't worth a dime, that they could be extracted from their bedrooms at any time that the master said that he wanted to come in, take your child, take him out, beat him to death, throw him in the river and tie a fan around his neck so that he'll stay on the bottom. Now, we came through those things. You and I saw that every day and we lived with that. I remember 2 or 3 days after that event, that my father woke me up and said, I want to take you out and show you something. He took me on the Natchez Trace Highway and showed me 2 greasy spots in the Natchez Trace and said, this is where your cousins were murdered last night. Not only were they murdered, they were castrated right here in Mississippi. My uncle was driving the school bus in Madison County, and he passed the school bus that was full of white children, and they stopped the school bus and opened the door and shot his eye out and his hand off just because he dared to pass another school bus here in Mississippi. The civil rights murders that occurred up in Philadelphia, Mississippi, the murder of Vernon Damon and Medgar Evers and all of those people that gave their lives in Mississippi. And the worst part of all of this, Doc, only 1/10 or less are known of the mass murders and the nameless graves that exist throughout this state today. I went down to Alcorn State University and I had an opportunity to go down in the Roxy, Mississippi and look at the slave quarters where the slaves were held underneath the porches of the old plantations. And so many brutal attacks and murders occurred with black males during that time until, yeah, we ought to celebrate Juneteenth, but maybe we ought to be celebrating it at a prayer meeting. And we ought to bless the spirit and thank our ancestors for fighting through this thing and getting us to this point. I think we ought to be in church this entire weekend on our knees.
We should be. And that's why I say that celebration that they're doing is misguided, misinformed, and is another pacification effort for black folks to look at so-called good deeds of white folks. I've looked at the venue. Most of the money that's been spent for this event, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, has been sponsored by European American companies and individuals. Look at the billboards and see who the sponsors are. Another pacification effort. Keep your black slaves that are alleged to be citizens happy. But at the same time, we're going to pass legislation to help destroy their public schools. At the same time, with billions of dollars in our coffers, we're going to hold on it, sit on it, and figure out how to give it to our people like we've always done. Politically, we're going to do everything we can to let black people think they have what we call some voter power, that they are in positions of responsibility. But we're going to do every legal maneuver we can come up with, gerrymandering, and other methods, which I would just call it outright vote fraud, and say blacks can't vote for their own people. They take out the black cells and insert that in a white district. They only going to have one representative of a black person in almost any state. Some states in the north, they have one statewide person. It might be an attorney general. Every now and then they might have a black governor. But most of the southern states never have a statewide elected or appointed official.
And now the state of Mississippi is 40% plus African Americans right now, today. At one point in time, there were more blacks in Mississippi than whites.
That's right.
And yet, we do not have a statewide elected official in the entire state. And we did have that even back in the days before Reconstruction, where, John R. Lynch and others were able to have a seat in Congress way back then, Doc.
That's right.
And we see no progress today. And as modern as we are, with our kids having gone to school, integration having taken place, we cannot even match the performance of black folk during that period.
No way we can do it. They had those guys that were born slaves, learn how to read and write on their own. Many enhanced their education after slavery, prior to what we call Reconstruction, from 1865 to about 1868. Many of them went back to school. About 1,000 black people went back to school. And many that were so-called free blacks moved to the South. And they even got themselves involved in business, politics, religion. The easiest way for a black man during that period is to come down as a preacher from the North, set up his own church, get him a congregation, and get involved in politics. They call them, scalawags and carpetbaggers and all kind of things. They were the elitist blacks, and most of them were born free. And they took over the South, only with the blessings of the federal government. But after Johnson got to be president of the United States, they killed Lincoln and so forth, and he's made a deal that we're going to get these federal troops out of the South and let the plantation owners take over. We're going to give them reparations for the slaves they lost, for the plantations they lost, and we're going to give them an opportunity to control economic development and politics one more time. And they abandoned the black folks.
And those reparations to the slave masters and plantations are still going on today.
Of course.
And so, you have more people that are paid by the government not to farm than you have people that are assisted in farming. And so that form of payment continues on today as a payment for the fact that the slavery had to be abolished, and they had to have a new way of living.
That's exactly right. And you would find that during that period, blacks didn't get any money. During the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s, blacks, farmers especially, got very little money. They had several suits, and they gave them about $50,000 apiece. They didn't advertise it wisely, and very few people knew anything about it. And as blacks, and I'm familiar with it because I have a lot of relatives that I try to get some money for, when you could get an application, it'd take 6 months to get one. You had to go and find it. Then when you found it, you had to fill it out and find somewhere to take it, and that would take 6 or 8 months. And then when you find somewhere to take the doggone application, you had to monitor the application, find out who was using it, reviewing it, and awarding the funds. That would take 2 or 3 years, and they ended up with millions of dollars that they didn't spend. Later on, they passed another farm bill, and they did the same thing. That's that second $50,000 that blacks could have gotten. And the thing happened again when Trump was president. He passed a 2018 farm bill that gave more money to white farmers and less to blacks because they were in a position to already have the land, have the debt, have the equipment, and they extended and eliminated much of the debt, gave them opportunities to buy equipment, buy more land, buy equipment, lease more land, all this for people that had a performance record of doing good in agriculture. And then they say, if you're getting old and you don't want to farm, we're going to pay you to let your land lay fallow.
To stay at home.
That's
Doc,
right.
we're getting ready to go to a break. You can call us at 800-492-5186. That's our call-in line. We're actually celebrating Juneteenth. I know it may not sound like it to you, but we are actually talking about the major issues that have arisen and kept the black man and black woman in a state of emergency where we find ourselves today. So we're going to come back and continue this conversation right after this break. Stay tuned.
June 19, 1865 was the day Union soldiers enforced President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and freed all remaining slaves in Texas. We can use Juneteenth as a way to acknowledge our past faults, help heal current divisions, and move toward a future as a nation more united. We believes in Juneteenth.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. And singing the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Happy Juneteenth from the We Believe family.
We're back live, and we're talking and broadcasting from Jackson, Mississippi at the We Believe Digital Broadcasting Studio. Tonight we're discussing the state of Black America as we celebrate Juneteenth. You know, Juneteenth now is a national holiday. The federal government has recognized that this ought to be a national holiday that blacks celebrate their freedom. And yet we're wondering, what do we have to celebrate? This discussion leads us to wonder if, in fact, we have a holiday to celebrate, or do we have a situation where we are on the decline and being pushed back into the years of slavery. And the question is real today. And so we're talking about those things that are going on that's causing Europeans and others to take a look at the state of Black America and devise plans and strategies to suppress any growth that we might have. So we have interesting dialogues that are occurring. We're talking about things, code words now, like CRT, critical race theory, and what does that mean? And WRP, WRT, the white replacement theory, and what does that mean? And so we're in some difficult times because the browning of America is demonstrated that the Proud Boys and other folk of different persuasions are not happy with what's going on in this country. And therefore you have the scaling in the wall and an attempted coup to overthrow the government because they need to overthrow democracy. Because if you're the minority in a country, democracy doesn't work well for you. You know, one man, one vote, when you're in the minority, won't work. And so we're up against some serious issues that we're going to have to deal with, and we better not be celebrating too much because, as Dr. Henderson has said, this country operates on a minimum of a 20-year plan, and that 20-year plan does not include African Americans. And so while we celebrate this weekend, there are some things that we need to put on the table, and leaders and people of influence and good sound minds should be discussing the next 20 years. What will the state of African Americans be in this country? Critical race theory. Well, the governor of the state of Mississippi said that we will not teach critical race theory in any public schools in Mississippi. And they enacted a law preventing the teaching of CRT in public schools. And it wasn't even being taught in the schools. So now we have a law that has been enacted to fix a problem that did not exist. But that's part of the 20-year plan. The governor understood that 20 years from today, somebody will start teaching it if he doesn't stop it now. And so Mississippi has said that that will not be taught in schools. And so the things that we're talking about here tonight, all of the things that involve the slave trade and the brutal civil rights war, the Civil War, and the brutal destruction of Black Wall Street after Reconstruction, and the mass murders and the unnamed graves and the hangings and the Emmett Tills and the civil rights lynchings that lead us up to today, the murders of Medgar and Vernon Hamer, all of these things that lead us up to where we are today are under tremendous threats because the current environment is not working well for Europeans as America continues to brown. So you can't teach critical race theory. The things we're talking about, they don't want their children to bear the cross, the burden of that history and that legacy. But yet our children have no idea of what happened to their ancestors and how they got here in the first place and why they act like they act under certain circumstances. You know, trauma. You know, we think now that all of our soldiers that went over to the Gulf, the Iraq War, is that, you know, people that came back now are suffering from some kind of trauma and they need therapy and they need programs to help them cope and deal with all of the tragedy and the murder and the mayhem that they experienced. But if you look at the brutality associated with what happened to Black folk in this country, there has never been any trauma to match that. To watch your mother being beat, to watch your sisters and brothers being separated and sold off. There's nobody has experienced any trauma like that. The trauma of coming over to America in those vessels stacked 3 high. Nobody experienced any trauma like that. and yet you can't even mention the word reparations. Because America said it owes no debt to the black man who built this country, who created the economy. There were more millionaires in the South than there were anywhere else in the world. And it was created, the economy was created on the backs of black folk. So yeah, we're going to celebrate Juneteenth, but we're going to talk about how we got here. And so now we see a new code word that's propped up today called WRT, the white replacement theory. What that means is that all white folk need to band together because we are afraid they are going to replace us, that the Negroes will replace us, that the minorities would replace us. And so you put tremendous pressure on the border. This is a country of immigrants, and yet you put more money on building a wall down on the south side to keep the immigrants from coming through. And you put more pressure in the states when you fail to approve Medicaid just because it was called Obamacare. And the state of Mississippi fails to even accept billions of dollars that would come into our state, and we're the poorest state in the nation. And we keep seeing and enacting policies and procedures designed to keep the black man down, to make absolutely certain that he doesn't even try to rise above his current condition. Policies. The black man just didn't leave the family. He was systematically removed from the family, which created all of this gang violence that we have now and the loss of respect for life, no self-esteem in the black child. Well, we walk the streets today and see black children 8, 9 years old with Uzis and AK-47s and who have no appreciation for life whatsoever. Because that delicate history was removed. As a black child, I grew up trying to step in my father's footsteps. As a little boy, I had to jump to get in his footstep, his footprint. They were so far apart until I had to have a running start to get into him. But that was my legacy. That was the man that I looked up to. Whatever I am today is because of what I saw in him. He was my provider and my protector and my disciplinarian. And we stole and took all that away from the black child. And now we want to call him murderous and out of control. He's out of control because we created the environment for him to be out of control. So we're going to celebrate Juneteenth. We're going to talk about the fact, as Dr. Henderson said, we're worse off today than we were in 1970. Worse off today than 1970. Dr. Henderson, I'm going to ask you to tell our viewers, how is it possible for blacks to be worse off today in this country than they were in 1970, when we are more educated? We had integration that came through and gave us an opportunity to go to the better schools, or the schools that were labeled as being better. And yet none of this has moved the needle for moving black folk forward.
Well, it's supposed to be that way. This so-called integration, believe it or not, and the records will prove, that integration was the worst thing happened to black folks since slavery. Going to the so-called #1 white college and university in any state was not a very good thing for black folks. If they could have done better, if the state would just say, we're going to keep it segregated, and instead of giving the white schools $10 or $15 million to accept a few blacks, we're going to give the black schools and universities 15 or 30 million to expand their programs and keep them separated. But they didn't want to do that because they know if you turn a man loose and give him equity, he is going to rise and his potential is going to increase to the point where he'll be a threat to you because you can't watch him. So what they decided to do to integrate and put a few blacks in positions of responsibility on paper in the classroom and claim those people as the ones that's going to be the new leaders in America. Brainwash them. Let them know that they can finish college. We're going to give you a job. We're going to give you an opportunity to be able to get you a nice car. We're going to let 2 or 3% of you all move into our neighborhood as long as you don't move in big groups. And every now and then we might let you come to the country club, but we're not going to let you become a member. And if you're a real good person, on special days, we might let you attend our church, but you cannot become a member. Because I remember during my time, the white deacons in Jackson, Mississippi, Bolton, Mississippi, and other places, when they start demonstrating during the 60s and trying to integrate the churches, would be standing at the church door. Deacons, assistant preachers, just regular members. And their job was to throw any Negro out of that door, throw him downstairs, and have him arrested. And I'm talking about during my lifetime, right here in Jackson, in Bolton, Edwards, New York City, and other places. That's all by design. They say if you want to keep someone from becoming equal, keep him segregated. But since they fought so much for segregation, to end segregation, they came with the word called integration, and they said we're going to integrate these black folks, but we're going to practice segregation within integration. We'll let them go to the same school, but we still going to put them in the special education class, in the general education class. And we're going to make sure that we get 2 or 3 in the college prep class, but we're going to keep them at a very, very low number. And we're going to brainwash them because we're going to send them to one of the elite white colleges or universities, and they're going to hate themselves by the time they finish. They're not going to want to go back to visit their little hometowns. And if they do, they're going to do like some of my cousins that had that so-called opportunity. They're not going to live with their parents anymore. They're going to live at a hotel. And they were living in those situations until they left home, until they went to college or university. They can't visit their parents. Get ready to use the bathroom. They had to get in their vehicles and go back to the hotels. And matter of fact, when they lived at home 30 and 40 years ago, they didn't even have an outhouse. Now I'm talking about things that happen today, 2022. The kids have been trained that you don't want to be living in the rural area. You don't want to stay overnight with your grandmother. In your day, that's what they did. They let these black folks that went to Chicago and Washington and other states, they would come home every summer and live with their old grandparents and their uncles and aunts. They cut that out. Because the so-called kids that we produce believe they are equal citizens in America. They are still excluded. They still have what I call a planned destiny of destruction and exclusion, economically, politically, socially, and religion. And if they think they're going to get reparation, they're losing their mind. That ain't going to happen no time soon because white folks are going to keep this integration versus segregation together, and they're going to dilute it and keep you all singing and dancing and praying, and that's what they're going to be doing today, Saturday, and Sunday with so-called Juneteenth. I told you earlier, I looked at the venue, singing, dancing, and praying. You're not going to have a lot of people talking about economic development. Now, they have a few programs with that, but now those people are going to be in numbers of 4 or 5 in those instances where you go on the inside and talk about economic development, starting a black bank. But 90% is going to be on the outside, singing and dancing and listening to the blues performers and the rappers and the choirs raise hell and stir the peace, and they're going to be happy because they tell them you can bring your tent, we're going to sell you some food. No liquor is allowed, but you know when they say that, that means bring some. You know that. So we're going to have good security, and you know what that means. Even the crooks are not going to show up because they already done told those police officers, if any gangbangers come around acting like they want to do something, you need to kill them. But people won't admit that. So the gangbangers are not going to be shooting up these things. Now, they might wait until they leave and attack them, but they're not going to do it during those sessions.
So, Doc, we got to remind our people their history.
That's right.
We got to hammer that point in so that they can take control of their destiny. Doc, you and I have fought our way through this thing to a point of a relative degree of success. The ability to live where we want to live and go where we want to go. And God's blessed us with modest health and a lot of wisdom. Comes from experience and education. To be street smart and educated is a wonderful thing, to put those two together. But you see, we lived it. Doc, I remember when blacks went to church at First Baptist in the basement of the First Baptist church. And for our viewers, First Baptist is the largest white congregation in Jackson. But blacks couldn't sit in the sanctuary with whites. They were relegated to the basement of that church. Now, they were relegated to the basement of the church because the Europeans knew that they needed to install religion in that base. So they couldn't say you can't go to church at all. So they put them in the basement. And then Mount Ham was probably the oldest black church that was created in the side of the city of Jackson for black folk, but created by white folk. All of our institutions, when we go back and look at the origin and see where did they come from and how were they created, we find that Europeans had a major hand in it. If you look at the origin of the NAACP and see who put it together, you look at the origin of the SCLC and see who put it together. When you look at all of the origins of our institutions, like Tougaloo College, one of the Eagle Queen that we are so blessed to have in our communities, but go back and look at its founders and see why it was created. For the most part, these institutions were created so that offsprings of Europeans would have somewhere to go. For the most part, black folks that came out of Africa were treated totally different. There was no consideration for their upward mobility and their growth. It was mandatory that they be kept down. And so we have two groups of black folks in America. And that one of them has allegiance to the continent of Africa as its homeland. The other one is a misplaced black that doesn't have allegiance to any place. He doesn't know anything about his history or where he came from. He doesn't want to know.
It's too painful, sir.
Too
painful
painful.
To know your history.
And as you say, don't want to stay with grandmama when he comes home. He wants to stay in the hotel. He doesn't want to go back and help build a fence and go to the cemetery and clean the graves and put markers on his ancestors from 1865 on. He doesn't want to be involved in that. And so what we get is we get a new breed of African Americans, as you say, that were put in place by Europeans to lead us according to the instructions that they get. And they have no allegiance and no feelings for African Americans and the struggle that black people have. And that's where we find ourselves today. Black man does not appreciate one another. They have no allegiance to our past, to our struggle. The disconnect in the family has occurred with the male being removed, and the disconnect from your heritage has occurred as well through integration and pseudo opportunities. So we have a bad situation here, Doc. We're getting ready to go to a station break, but we're going to come back for our last segment, and we're going to talk about Juneteenth, and we're going to celebrate it, but we're going to train and we're going to talk about what we need to do besides celebrate it. Okay. We're broadcasting live right here in Jackson, Mississippi. Our host, Dr. Eldridge Henderson, a renowned orator and a speaker all over this country, is in the studio with us this evening. We'll be right back.
Socrates Garrett ENT.com is a diversified firm specializing in recycled aggregates and crushed concrete. Socrates Garrett ENT.com's recycled materials provide the construction industry with significant economic and environmental benefits by recycling clean concrete rubble into M.DOT grade rock materials. Recycled aggregates and crushed concrete can be applied to driveways, road construction, bank protection, parking lots, general bulk fills, and more. By using Socrates Garrett ENT.com's crushed concrete products, anyone from homeowners to general contractors can help reduce landfilled concrete waste, conserve natural resources, and gain significant economic savings on materials and disposal costs. For more information, please call 601-896-0084 or visit us online at SocratesGarrettENT.com.
Hi, I'm Q Talicia Garrett. I am here to introduce our New South Development and Training Outreach Hour every Tuesday at 2 p.m., giving you information on how to become a part of the programs through USDA and Farm Service Agency. We can be reached at 678-779-9468. We can also be found online at newsouthoutreach.com.
We're back live. We're broadcasting live from Jackson, Mississippi at the We Believe Digital Broadcasting Studio. You can call us and share in this program at 800-492-5186. We're being seen in over 139 different countries. We're on Facebook, on YouTube, on Roku TV. We're on our own platform, WeBelieveDigital.com. It's critically important that we share our history with the world, that we understand why we have so many European sponsors that are willing to sponsor events like the celebration of Juneteenth, and yet not willing to sponsor the advancement of education in African American schools. And while we're struggling so hard to gain some kind of economic footprint, some toehold, while we still are being redlined by the financial institutions, and the black man can't get a loan to go into business. He still can get a loan to buy a car, but he can't get a loan to buy inventory to go into business. And so we got difficult things we're going to talk about, but we're going to fight our way through it like our ancestors did, and we're going to get to where we need to be. Now, we're celebrating Juneteenth. You know, in 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation declared the slaves were free. But not many blacks knew that they had been freed. And those in Texas didn't know for 2 years later. So they continued to be slaves for 2 years. And that's not an unusual occurrence. Dr. Henderson, we were talking about why blacks didn't race to their freedom even after they got the word that they had been freed. How the mindset had been conditioned to, even in the state of dire poverty and brutality, some blacks opted to stay in that environment. How and why did that occur?
Well, that was also by design. See, the European American knows that if you cut off all the economic opportunities for anything, human or non-human, where they don't have a degree of independence, where they can't take care of themselves, where they can't take care of their family, they have no money, no transportation, no land, where are you going to go? A lot of the black people left the plantation, and history will show this, for 2 or 3 days. And over 90% of them came back because they started getting hungry. They started getting cold. They got tired of walking. They got tired of fighting the Ku Klux Klan sympathizers, which they call them militias and so forth. Because the white folks, the European slaveholders, didn't want them black folks to leave those plantations, and many of them got together and told the blacks, don't worry about it. You don't have to be slaves. I will take care of you. I will give you a house. I'll give you some land. I'll give you clothing. And I'll give you implements, horses and mules, wagons, and you just stay here. And you don't have to pay me anything until you produce something. And when you produce some corn or cotton or rice or whatever they did in that region, you pay me 1/2 or 1/4 of it, and then you pay your debt out of your part. And that was the scheme that got black folks back into slavery legally. And then when the few blacks started economically advancing, they said, now some of these Negroes buying land. They started their own little schools at their churches. They started little hospitals, health clinics, starting their own banks. So we got to watch this. These Negroes trying to act like they're white folks. So then they passed a bunch of laws called vagrancy laws, where if Socrates Garrett went downtown and he didn't have a pass to show that he had a job, I guarantee you by sundown he was going to have one, because the sheriff would take him to jail and call his buddy and say, I got 10 more, and you can come and get them tomorrow morning and take them down to your mine or to your plantation or to your store and let them work for you till they pay the fine. Don't worry about it, boss. I'll come and get them. Your fine might be $200. Where are you going to get $200 from when you don't have any money? So you're gone from your children. Then your poor wife is at home by herself. They had something for her. They said, well, Mary Ann, you come on over to the house here, and we're going to give you a job. If you got a daughter, you bring her, because she's going to assist you. And if you have a young son, you bring him too. So we're going to put him in the yard, and he's going to take care of the animals and whatever. And when you leave, we're going to make sure that you're fed. Anything left over from what you cook, you can take it with you. What am I going to wear, boss? Don't worry about it. We're going to give you our old clothes. And I'm talking about during my lifetime. It progressed to that point in the 50s, 60s. During my lifetime, I know of instances like that. So when the old mother or grandmother got too old, they got that young girl that was 13 or 14 or 15 to take her role.
Doc, hold your point just a moment. Grab your headset there. Caller, you're on the line.
Good evening. Good evening, Mr. Garrett. What a wonderful show you got going on tonight. And it's so much history. And you know, the only question I got is in the midst of all this craziness that you are speaking about, what are the solutions? How is the South going to rise again? And I'll take my answer off the air if you're able to comment on it. And thank you for a wonderful show.
Thank you, caller. We'll try and address that. So the caller wants to know, some of the solutions and what are we going to do to change the conditions? And that's a great question.
An excellent question.
And so we believe that the key to change is in effective leadership. That there is no other way that you can change your conditions until you get effective leadership that has a commitment to the history of the struggle for black folk, that appreciates the contributions that black folks made, that are proud of their lineage and their heritage and their dark complexion, that black folks that are willing to sign a contract with Black America that says that we're going to do everything in our power to improve the economics of our community, that we're going to represent the constituencies that sent us down here, that black folk that says that when they see another black person, they have a special feeling inside, that they have a warm feeling and appreciation for who that person is and where they came from, that goes all the way back to the garden and on the banks of the Nile and in Jackson, Mississippi in 2022. When you walk the streets and you see a black child with a Uzi or AK-47 and his pants down below his knees, that you don't think of that child as something sinister and something less than human, but you see the conditions that the environment has created that we must now repair. We, as the leaders and the elders, must now repair this brokenness that's in our community. And we can do that as leaders. So to the call, the solution lies in visionary leadership that, Doc, you say just doesn't grow up on its own, but has to come through some process.
Exactly. And the bad news is you can't expect solutions to come from the present leadership. Now, the strongest leader I know in America today that's doing something significant is a Mississippian, and that's Congressman Benny Thompson. He is a strong leader. He is working to help channel democracy in the right way. He's over this January 6th commission. He's not a bought man. He is independent. But white folks made him that way. I remember when he was a young school teacher. They didn't want him to teach black history. They got rid of him. They fired him out of the school system. Now, if they had left him alone, he would be probably a principal or a superintendent now, probably would have been retired. But they fought him, so he got elected in politics. They discriminated against him. Even had black people walking all night. My dad was telling me about this last week. Walking all night to tell other black people, don't vote for Benny Thompson when he was running for an alderman, when he was running for mayor of Bolton, when he was running for supervisor in Hinds County. Some of those folks are still alive today. They're in their 90s, late 80s, that were against him. They were his friends. They went to school with his mother. They knew his father, but he was considered a radical at that time. And then he got to be a congressman. And he has done some great things for Hinds County, for the state of Mississippi, for Tougaloo College and other institutions in the South, because he is economically independent. So you got to create more folks like that, and you're not going to have these outsiders that started the NAACP, the Urban League, participating in it because they will get their folks to do it. And the only way we will get a solution to this thing is where the black church going to have to start reasserting its power that it had it right after 1865 during Reconstruction, where they were independent institutions that trained their own people, had their own businesses, and they had to do everything for themselves, starting banks, institutions like hospitals and so forth, and they were not contaminated initially. And white folks say, this got to change. And that's when they started creating their own schools, like Tougaloo, Howard University, and told those black folks, you don't need your school anymore. We're going to finance a school system. They got some of them Europeans from New York and other places. They sent millions of dollars throughout the South to set up their own schools. And that's when they started using that same tactic, where they would send their white female teachers down here and a few white males, very few. And they took over the education in the South. And then the few blacks that had church schools, they were so economically deprived until they eventually had to go to the county superintendent and beg the county superintendent to take over my school because we don't have any more money. I attended a school like that. It was once a private high school / junior college. They froze it out. The money was tight. And the board of trustees of this black institution had to go to the white board of trustees, which they had some white members on the black board of trustees, and say, "Boss, we can't make it anymore." They said, "Don't worry about it. We'll take care of you. We're going to dissolve your school. We're going to dissolve your independence, and we're going to make you part of our public school community college system." That happened all over the South. And they said, "Well, we're going to let you keep your identity. You're going to have your own identity. You can have your own programs." And they let that go on for a few years. And now most of those so-called black community colleges throughout the South have been reintegrated into the initial system that they had when they were taken over by the state. They're gradually disappearing. The programs have changed.
And the leadership had changed.
I guarantee you.
And so you're saying schools like Utica, Mississippi, and those of you from Mississippi understand the history, the rich history of Utica. Utica Junior College was there, black people. Today, you can't find Utica. It's a part of Hines Community College now. It's been taken over by Hines. You know, you had Capel Lincoln now. South, you know, all of these schools were down there that have now been engulfed by Europeans.
And that's because the white folks say, "We're going to save you, black folks. Say, don't you suffer and try to raise money. We're going to help you out. Just turn it over to us. We're going to let one of you all, in some instances, 2 of you, be on the board of directors." Yes, sir, boss. I used to attend those meetings when I was a young instructor. They would have the black board meet after the white board meet. They would spend the money in the first board meeting, and if they had $200,000 or $300,000 left, they'd get the black folks $5,000 of that for their school, and they had more students than the white school.
Carla, you're on the air.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. How y'all doing?
We're doing fine, sir.
Good. Listen, I was looking at a study. It was done in 2017 called The Road to Zero Wealth. Don't know if you're familiar with it, but it just talks about black wealth, how in 2053 we will have zero assets in terms of net worth. And they started back in 1983 and looked at some numbers and said the average net worth for the black household in America was about $7,000. And then today it's about $24,000. And they compared that to the white households at about $186,000 in terms of net worth. But what's amazing about the study is it shows us growing at a snail pace, and in some cases, in some of the metrics, going backwards. So my question to you guys, again, is like the previous caller: how do we correct that? And it has to be more than just through our leaders. Is that some of the responsibility that we have to take on for ourselves to be more responsible? And Mr. Garrett, I want you to speak to how we can address this through, again, the leaders giving contracts to minority businesses and minority businesses supporting other minority businesses. And I'm going to say this, and I'm going to hang up and listen. you speak about economics as being the solution to a lot of the problems that we face in our Black communities. And I agree wholeheartedly with you. If we had our own businesses, instead of our children going, say, to a Walmart to work where they're told what to do, if they could go to our businesses and make decisions, then we would be more inclined to work at these businesses. We would be more inclined to own businesses. But when you go to a job and, okay, you do this, that, and the other, and that's what you do, and that's what you're supposed to do, that's not a good environment for our young people. So if we had our own minority businesses where we could give our young people management jobs and career paths for growth, that would mean so much more to them. So I'm gonna be quiet and I'm gonna listen. I'm gonna let you guys provide your input there.
Thank you for the call.
Yeah.
The caller is concerned about the status of Black America and net worth, and we're losing ground every day. The standard of living and the quality of life for my children is going to be less than it was for you and I, even though we came through that turbulent time where we witnessed all of the events that were occurring. But we got a good education. We went to those black schools and we got a good education and we fought our way through this thing. But our children's future doesn't look as bright as ours. Now, caller, the question is going to require some time, and we're running out of time. So I'm going to just give you a highlight on the essence of your question, but we'll deal with it next week. The most important thing that can occur in the African American community is the building of a black business class. The same thing that black folks did after Reconstruction when they built Black Wall Street. The number one priority in the African American community should be the building of a strong black business class. That is the foundation for our solutions. That's how we hire our children. That's how we train our children. That's how we establish role models and raise self-esteem, because I'm looking at successful people. Now, in order to do that, we have to control the dollars that we collect and control. There's $1 billion flowing through Hinds County that are controlled by African American leaders. It breaks my heart to see Hemp Hill Construction Company and Delta Construction Company and all of these white engineering firms and architecture firms getting all of the work in a black community that's in this donut hole that is suffering from poverty, and that the children are screaming and crying every day for something good that they can hold on to. We have to build a strong black business class. All contracts for goods and services ought to be contracted with firms that are located in Jackson, Mississippi. We ought to write policies that establish preferences, treatment for those businesses. We ought to declare a state of emergency in Jackson, Mississippi. With 154 homicides that have occurred and being the number one murder capital of the world, you are in a state of emergency. Declare the state of emergency and suspend the purchasing laws and empower the economics of the folks that live here. It's going to require that kind of action. And white folk expect us to take care of ourselves, but black folk are out white folk and not doing it. And so we get less than 2% of contracts for goods and services. And until we make this $1 billion turn over inside of our own city limits and our own county limits at least 5 times, then we can't change the economic conditions of our people. And so We're going to deal with that, Carla, as we come back on some specifics on home rule ought to be established. We ought to petition the legislature for home rule. We ought to make it absolutely mandatory that if you're working for Jackson, that you live and work in this city. You ought to make it absolutely clear that all potential savings that can be had from contracts are acquired. We have to protest and march in the streets against black folk when black contractors are $1.2 million a year less than white contractors for garbage collections, and yet they are denied the opportunity to have that contract. We ought to march and protest and fight for repeal laws, recall laws, and change the situation at the polls. We have to do that. We have to fund our police department. We have to fund our school systems. And the only way you fund something is from the economics inside of your economy. And so $1.2 million savings a year in Jackson would put an additional 100 police officers on the street. And yet, black leaders vote not to accept the $1.2 million savings, but want to award the contract to Europeans that have had it for over 35 years. We're going to have to fight this thing. We're going to have to break through, black folk. We're going to have to stand up. We got to go out here and celebrate Juneteenth this evening. We got to dance and sing, and we got to party, and we got to go to work. We got to go to work. Black folk, we have to do our own work. We have to pick up our own garbage. We have to treat our own wastewater. We have to treat our own drinking water. We have to fix our distribution lines. We have to fix our infrastructure and our potholes. We have to have our own asphalt plant. We have to have our own fueling stations. We have to have things that control the economy. Until we buy into that philosophy that we're in a dire state of emergency, then we'll continue to lose. This has been We Believe Digital's broadcast of Socrates Garrett Live that comes to you each Friday. I hope you enjoy this holiday weekend, and we look forward to visiting with you next week. Have a good night and stay safe.
Advertise on WeBelieve.global, a brand new digital media platform. Share your brand with our audience on our many global live stream TV broadcasts and over the radio. For more info, visit WeBelieve.global or call 800-492-5186 option